Hello and welcome back to ATA's EconChat, brought to you by the Australian Taxpayers Alliance. I am your host, ATA's Chief Economist, John Humphreys, and I am joined by my now co-host, Adept Economics Director, Gene Tunny. Gene, how you doing?
Very well, John. Good to be chatting with you again.
Now, I don't know if you picked this up from last week, but I called our chat by the wrong name. This live stream is called the EconChat. And I very cheekily referred to it last week at one point as Econ Talk. So my apologies to Russ Roberts and his far more established, far more interesting podcast series called Econ Talk. If anyone listening to this is unaware of Econ Talk, I strongly encourage you, go out, Google that, find that. Russ Roberts is a very interesting economist with some good ideas, but also a good way at getting to the bottom of other people's ideas. So I did not mean to imply that we are at that level yet. We'll get there, Gene. We'll get there.
Yeah.
If you are watching this is an unscripted, live, interactive live stream. We don't have, we're not going off a script here, as you can tell by the fact that I'm already stuttering. So we're not going off a script. It is live. It is interactive. You can interact with us, get in on the chats, and we try to talk back. If you have questions, criticisms, comments, we can put them up here as we go, and we can get sidetracked. Indeed, I quite enjoy getting sidetracked. So feel free to ask us some difficult questions, throw us some curveballs, see if you can make us speechless live on air. It could be fun for you as well. So if you're watching this now, please give it a like, and in whatever medium you're watching it, please give us a follow there. So this is being live streamed on the Good Source, on the Australian Taxpayers Alliance pages, and on my personal pages, John Humphreys, and both on Facebook and on YouTube. If you're enjoying this, please go and find us on YouTube. Give us a like, follow us there, and please go and find us on Facebook. Give us a like, follow us there, and share it if you think anyone would enjoy these chats, or if you think you know someone who can write a comment that will sufficiently confuse both Gene and myself so that you can make us look stupid live on air. Feel free. That is a challenge. I invite you to. Look, I also want to get into the habit of just pointing you towards any events that are coming up. I forgot to do this last week. I'll try to remember. Just the two I've got off the top of my head. I won't get too distracted. But the AIP, the Australian Institute for Progress, has an event coming up this Thursday. I believe it's a lunch. They're talking about the debate on population growth. They've got two speakers with two different opinions. So if you're interested in that topic and you're in the Brisbane area, check it out. The Australian Institute for Progress is hosting that. That's this Thursday, the 2nd of February, and this Friday, the 3rd of February, we have our own Liberty on the Rocks. If you're in Sydney, Brisbane, or Melbourne, and you just want to sit back, have a beer with a few other people and chat about freedom, economics, and politics, then come along to Liberty on the Rocks. But also our friends over at, I think, the Menzies Centre. I'm probably getting that wrong, but there's a Menzies book launch happening on Friday as well, Friday the 3rd of February in Brisbane. So if you can Google that and to find out the details. I don't have them with me. I'll put them in a link after this live stream's finished underneath these live streams for both of those events if you're interested. But that's some introductory stuff, hopefully pointing you in the right direction. Speaking of introductory stuff, we normally start by having a quick recap, a look to see if the world's gone mad in the last week since we've spoken to you last, and what's new in economics. Often I have a quick look at the ABS, but just as I try and find the latest ABS stuff here, Gene, what's new in the last week? How did the world go crazy, sane, or somewhere in between?
Oh, how did the world go crazy? Well, I mean, look, I think the war in Ukraine is escalating quite rapidly, and now we see that, Israel has launched an attack against Iran, and then not making any judgments on those, but I think on those events, but the world is becoming a more dangerous place. So they're going to be big stories over this year. I think that geopolitical risk is going to still be an element this year. And in terms of the local data, I think you're going to talk about what's been happening with the economic data here, aren't you?
I was just about to bring that up, but you say you mentioned those points without judgment. Go into it. It is a crazy situation we're in, being so influenced by these geopolitical factors, seemingly well outside of our control. It is frustrating, but also watching from the sidelines. well, maybe we won't get down that rabbit hole now because we've got some much more fun rabbit holes to dive down. But maybe in the future we could look at the economics of the Ukraine war. That could be a fun one. I'll let you off the hook now. I'll bring this up as you were saying. So there's two pieces of data came out in the last week that's worthwhile just keeping tabs on the economy. One is that inflation has ticked up again, and the next one is that retail sales have ticked down. So look, it's both of those are bad pieces of news, but I got to say, at least as I see the world, both of those were quite predictable pieces of news. So you've got here, you can see the chart I'm sharing with you here. This is the press release from the ABS, and you can just see at the end here, this is the increase in inflation that we've all been living through. So that's like this is over more than a year that this upward trend's been happening, and you can see we've now hit the top of that blue line. We've now hit 7.8% annualized inflation. The data was just released was 1.9% for the December quarter, but most people think in annual, so I'll speak in the way most people think. Annualized now at 7.8, so nearly 8% inflation. And that's not pretty, and that's higher than the last number that was being quoted. But while that's a negative piece of news, I would just say that I think this was thoroughly predictable and thoroughly predicted. And so, Gene, you were saying before how when this news came out, the instinctive reaction by some people was that, well, I'll let you say it.
Oh, well, what I've found amusing over the last few days, John, not that I'm amused by the data, but it's always funny. I mean, the media are just looking for comment that goes along with what the latest bit of news is, and we had that inflation number, and so we see economists who are saying, oh, the RBA is really going to have to increase interest rates a lot more. So there was an economist, I think, from Deutsche Bank, who's been saying that we'll have to have 4 more rate rises this year. And so there was that bit of data, and now there's another bit of data you're going to talk about very soon, where now they'll find a commentator or so, actually, they should pause. So, I mean, it's so hard to know what's going to happen, what's in the RBA's mind, because we've got these data that are arguably conflicting. So I think you're going to cover that other piece of data now, aren't you?
I was, yeah. I've got to say, I think, I know it wasn't you saying it, but you're quoting other people. That is what they say. I want to push back against the idea that it's conflicting. This is the cliche idea of the trade-off, where the economy is just one simple thing with one simple lever, and either it's overheating in all directions or it's underheating in all directions. And that is maybe a useful mechanical way to explain economics to a grade 10 class when you're first getting the idea out. But the economy is much more fluid and messy and more organic and mechanical than that. And it shouldn't be a surprise to anyone that we could have an economic slowdown and inflation at the same time, because they're caused fundamentally by two different things. You have a slowdown by a lack of productivity growth fundamentally, and you have inflation by printing too much money. Now, the printing too much money can hide the slowdown for a while, but fundamentally, both of those things could coexist. Bad microeconomic policy could lead to an economic slowdown, and bad macroeconomic policy could lead to inflation at the same time. And that's what these two data points show. As you say, this one right here shows us the inflation continuing up, and this next one here, the headline here, retail sales down 3.9%. That is over only the 1 month. This is monthly data, not quarterly data. It shows that December sales are down seasonally adjusted. So that's the slowdown in the economy that's happening simultaneously with the increase in inflation. And you're right. Some people see that and they instantly draw conclusions and make comments about how this is going to require more interest rate rises, fewer interest rate rises. One of the tricks, and this is my first little chance of giving a mini economic lesson today, I'm sure I'll find more. New information, when they release the data, if the data is as expected, that is not new information. It is new information that should determine the change in your behavior or the change in your predictions or the change in the stock market. Right? If they make an announcement that we already knew they were going to make, that's not new information. And I would say both of these data points are roughly consistent with expectations, especially the CPI one. I don't think that shocked anyone. We knew that CPI was going to officially tick up at least one more time. And then I think the expectation is it'll start to tick down in the following quarters. And if it keeps following expectations, it shouldn't change our behavior. Our behavior should change when our understanding of the situation changes, not just because data drops on the ABS website. So I think you're right that a lot of commentators do that, but they shouldn't. So yeah, this was the second point. Retail sales slowing down. I'm not surprised. As I think we've said before, we might be on slightly different pages with this. I think in some ways Australia is already in a mild recession, and I think we're trending ever closer towards getting into an official one, although I'm not sure that official matters that much.
Mm.
You got the
John,
same
what
view?
about the Black Friday sales? There was some commentary that there was a bring forward of spending into November, and that partly explains that drop in December. I mean, it couldn't explain all of it, but that was one of the explanations.
Quite right. No, that's absolutely true. So firstly, I mean, the December numbers actually did go up in real terms, but we're talking seasonally adjusted as we should, because December has Christmas shopping. So we already adjust for that. And then what you see here is a big drop in December, but you can see here an increase in November that looks out of line with normal low-level increases that you'd expect in a normally functioning economy. So this seems to, that would lend weight to that idea that the seasonally adjusting benchmark is being adjusted by the fact that some people are bringing forward their Christmas shopping. So that's an interesting little tidbit here. But the downturn can't be explained entirely by November, as you can see by the size of those two bars. But that is a very good point. Well made. We've got a couple of comments coming through. I know, I'll give this one to you, Gene, if you like. John McCauley asks, Elbow says electricity prices are expensive because of Putin. Is that true?
Yes, to some extent, or to probably, a lot of the reason is that. But there's also the fact that we had issues with reliability of the system. I mean, we had that crisis last year, middle of last year, when we had, because we didn't have enough generation capacity, and that was partly due to a lack of maintenance during the pandemic. Apparently, we couldn't get the people to travel around or come from overseas or wherever they have to come to service the generator. So I had a chat with an engineer on my podcast about this, and look, it's complex. It's partly Putin. It's partly the fact that we're going rapidly into a world with more renewables, less reliable power, and if you get the renewables and you don't have the backup storage, then that can create big problems for your grid. So look, it's a complex situation. I think this is, John, we might have to come back to this after we've had a bit more of a look at it, because it is a very complex area. One thing I would note is that with the whole issue with Putin, I think how that's ended the political debate is that because the Prime Minister has said that, don't blame us for our election commitment being not being able to, we can't meet our election commitment of cutting power prices by whatever it was, however many dollars, $250, I can't remember exactly, because of the war in Ukraine. But I mean, the war in Ukraine started, all the energy prices started increasing before Elbow made that commitment. So you can't actually use as an excuse. So I think that's how that's entered into that's the relevant political issue.
It was an interesting sleight of hand, that one, I got to say. The idea that they were caught unawares by a war that had been already going on for 5 months. That's it was an odd piece of political sophistry, although you'd expect it. Look, to answer John's question, firstly, I agree. Maybe we should do a deep dive in this and bring it back as a subject we bring intentionally here. And then we might have a few more interesting data points to give you. But off the top of my head on this one, it is undoubtedly true that it's part of the story. Now, it is in their political interest to exaggerate how much of the story it is, because the other parts of the story is Australia's energy policy has not been focused on ensuring cheap, reliable energy for a long time, because there's been other boondoggles to chase, other political votes to chase by saying that energy is about something else. Cheap, reliable energy is hugely fundamentally important to the success of any country. And for growth in any country. But we got sidetracked for a while thinking that, we can just take it for granted. It goes without saying we have cheap, reliable energy, so we can introduce all of these other goals that we're going to search for that are something other than that. And that's also partly to blame. And of course, the government has little incentive to admit that part of the equation, so they play up the first part. But I don't want us to fall into the equivalent trap in reverse and try and pretend that it has nothing to do with it, because it certainly does. And the reason is, and this seems strange to people, because we have enough gas in Australia, so we don't need European gas. We have enough petrol in Australia. We have enough uranium in Australia. We just choose not to use it. We have enough coal in Australia. So why would a disaster on the opposite side of the world impact us? And the reason is that we're involved in international trade. So when the international gas price goes up, our gas price goes up because our gas producers have the option of selling it to us, or Australian gas energy producers, or they could ship it overseas. Now, it's not exactly equal, so it doesn't just exactly go up, but it does impact it because we are in a globalized economy. So when international coal prices go up, even though we have enough coal and we don't have to export it, we are in the export business. So when the export price goes up, that lures the coal overseas. To keep the coal in Australia, our price goes up a little bit. So it is something to do with, right? So we shouldn't deny that, because denying that puts us on weaker ground. It's far better to be on the solid ground of being correct, and that way we can push back much more strongly. So let's admit that's part of the story, and then push them back with the other part of the story. Why didn't they focus on cheap, reliable energy for the last 20 years instead of just trying to be loved by the international three-letter agencies? So that's my answer to that one. A few other comments coming in. I like this one. I do have a drink and I am settled in. That's a response to my original comment. So welcome, Percy. Welcome, everyone else. Look, I'm going to look through these comments as we have our next chat. We're going to break into... We've now got a new format here where we explore two stories. Jean brings one to the table. I bring one to the table. This week, Jean's going first. So, Jean, with nothing further ado, what is your topic for today? What are we looking at?
Okay, thanks, John. Look, I think we have to chat about this essay by the Treasurer, Jim Chalmers, Capitalism After the Crises. Rather extraordinary for a Treasurer to publish something like this. I mean, although we had the former PM, Kevin Rudd, publish something similar about how he was going to save global capitalism in, I think it was around February 2009, while we were all busy in Treasury with actually managing the budget and all of that. Somehow the PM found time to write a 8,000-word essay, and now, I mean, Jim Chalmers has done, well, I think his is 6,000. It may not be as long as the one Rudd wrote. Jim Chalmers wants to remake Australian capitalism. I don't know if he necessarily wants to remake global capitalism, but he does have a critique of neoliberalism. So that's the new thing that everyone hates. And I mean, it's similar to a lot of critiques of so-called neoliberalism, that we've gone too far in the direction of the market and we don't care about society as much anymore, and isn't this all dreadful, and isn't all this inequality terrible, and it's causing problems for democracy. Now, look, okay, there's certainly issues, and in some countries inequality has certainly increased. There's no doubt about that. But overall, it's this very simplistic analysis. And look, it's Jim Chalmers's views. I mean, fine. It's his philosophy. It's probably what you'd expect from Jim Chalmers. He's entitled to those views. I mean, my personal view is you should be looking at specific policies. I mean, what exactly do you think we did wrong? Okay, let's look at specific issues and see how we can fix those up. I mean, is it tariff cuts you don't approve of? I mean, tariff cuts that the Hawke-Keating government supported. I mean, what is it precisely that you think is the problem? So there's this general critique of neoliberalism, which is no different from a lot of stuff you see online by various progressives. And look, I mean, I'm not necessarily going to defend everything that's been done in economic reform. I mean, there have certainly been, I think there have been some great successes, but there have also been areas where it's had less than stellar results. There's no doubt about that. But I think what's important is to get it, well, okay, let's understand what he actually wants to do, because he's got this general critique, okay, but what do you want to do? And his main idea seems to be this idea of co-investment. That's the real substantive thing. That seems to be how he's going to define his time as treasurer. This is or his time as PM if he later becomes PM, because in a way this is a job application for PM. He wants to be Labor leader. He sees this as defining his philosophy as a Labor treasurer. We're going to fix capitalism. He talks about values-based capitalism. He thinks capitalism, we want to move away from a system where it relies upon people being self-interested and greedy and the private sector alone. We want to have a cooperation between the private sector and the public sector. We want the public sector getting the policy settings right and then co-investing with the private sector. And he provides some ideas about how that will occur. He talks about the Clean Energy Finance Corporation, which is designed to provide finance for various renewable energy projects. He sees that as a success, even though it doesn't appear to be meeting its investment mandate. So I had a look at that because I found it interesting that was his one, the example that he gave. So he talks about co-investment as a powerful tool at our disposal. The Clean Energy Finance Corporation has been a great success, partnering with investors to direct capital where it can have the greatest impact, not by subsidizing returns, but by helping structure investment vehicles in a rapidly emerging economic sector. We will employ this co-investment model in more areas of the economy, with programs already underway in the industry, housing, and electricity sectors. Okay, so they're looking at providing some type of framework, having these entities like the Clean Energy Finance Corporation, and I think they've set one up similar to that in housing. It's to encourage investment by the private sector and by, I guess, providing more accessible finance or creating financial products, perhaps with some government guarantee. I don't know. We have to wait and see what exactly the Treasurer is talking about here. So, yeah, that's where I think we've really got to focus. This seems to be his idea of how he's going to be this innovative, new wave Labor treasurer. And I think, Nick's made a good point here in the comments that, they want the super funds to invest in some of these areas such as housing or an infrastructure. But again, I mean, we've got to ask exactly how they going to do that. What I see as a risk is the risk that the government provides some sort of guarantee, or it does provide finance. He's saying it's not subsidized, but I mean, you've got to wonder about if it isn't subsidized, or if the government's not making finance more readily available than the market would, than the banks would, then what exactly is the market failure they're addressing? Why wouldn't the private sector do it? So I think there is going to be some sort of subsidy or additional or risk taken on by the public sector that's not compensated for. And so when I looked at the Clean Energy Finance Corporation webpage on financial outcomes, I discovered that, and this is what, this is an institution that the Treasurer claims has been a great success. Its return, its lifetime annualized portfolio benchmark return. So this is the return that they've earned. So 4.38%. Hang on, that's what it's that's what it's supposed to earn. So 4.38%, which is hardly anything really if you think about what you'd really want to be earning as an investment vehicle like that. So I think there is a risk that this sort of thing is subsidized. I think there's a risk that they're taking too much risk onto the government balance sheet, and there's a potential to fund projects which are uneconomic. So look, if that's the big idea, I mean, okay, well, let's see the specifics and let's analyze exactly what you're recommending, and we can talk about that. And there's that point about, they do want access to the super funds money. They will have to make sure that it is a compelling investment opportunity to actually get that money, and that is a big risk. I mean, we don't. Yeah, those super funds, if they just invest in something because the government wants them to invest in it, then they are breaching their duty, their fiduciary duties. That would be a terrible thing if the government does direct where that money should go. So
Nick raises an interesting point on that, and I think this is part of the problem, that we're sneaking up on this situation in several ways. Super funds increasingly have social goals that they need to meet, as well as financial goals. You make a good point that, well, they need to show that they're going to meet the financial needs of the super investors. Increasingly, the super funds feel the need to meet their social KPIs rather than their financial KPIs. And if they're required to meet social KPIs, then they'll very easily get away with it. Remember, it's not like the super is optional. We're forced to give it. And if the government gives the super funds, who have guaranteed access to our money, social KPIs, you must do something social. By the way, here's something social we want you to do. You can imagine it happening even if it doesn't have financial returns. I think that's what I think Nick's point is. Nick can correct me if I have not expressed her concern accurately. Please jump into the chat again, Nick, but that's my understanding of your point.
Yeah, so the whole thing with this values-based capitalism, one of the concerns is that, you end up with this very odd relationship between the government and banks and super funds. And in a way, it's very odd for a Labor leader or an aspiring Labor leader. And this is a point that Matt Canavan made, that, I mean, he was very critical, as you probably would expect, of this sort of thing. And I mean, he was saying that the Treasurer seems to is spending too much time in the boardrooms of banks and super funds. So, yes, it's very strange. But what I think might be going on, and this is one thing that I'm wondering, is this because he really doesn't have many other options due to the state of the budget, due to the high amount of debt, and due to the fact that he's committed to the stage 3 tax cuts? Catherine Murphy on the Guardian podcast asked him, okay, if you're talking about values-based capitalism, does this mean, or she was basically asking him, if you actually, given what you're professing about values-based capitalism and your concerns about inequality, etc., does this mean you'd revisit those stage 3 tax cuts? And I thought that was a good question. And he just gave the standard line, he said, look, we've already dealt with that, and you know my position on that. I think she probably could have pressed him more on that, because it is a legitimate question. If, in terms of a traditional Labor government, some people have been saying that with this essay, Jim Chalmers is channeling Whitlam, or they're going back to the Whitlam government. I'm not entirely sure about that, because the Whitlam government was big spending on social welfare programs. They really ramped that up. I mean, I know now we are spending more on that sort of thing, but I don't know if there's a capacity for this government, given the fiscal situation, to really increase those welfare payments or expand the welfare state much at all. And so he's really falling back on this sort of thing because he may not have any other option. And to an extent, that's because the government's had to go along with the stage 3 tax cuts for political reasons to win the last election, and now they can't go back on it. So, this could be the only shot he's got in the locker, so to speak. That's one thought I've had on this essay.
Yeah, it'll be interesting to see what they do in the next budget in terms of tax. I suspect they'll sneak the tax rate up going to that. Look, I think they were just politically hamstrung with their previous commitments. And quite frankly, I think they made the right decision to stick to their promise, both because I'm a big advocate of the stage 3 tax cuts, but also politically, if you want to keep any political capital, you can't just line up lie after lie after lie in your first year in power. So I think it was the right political move and the right economic move. I suspect they also know it's the right political move. They think it's the wrong economic move, but they're stuck with it. And so I'm happy about that. Yeah, a couple of pontifications. I haven't thought about this article as long as you have, but I think you're right in one very important point. There's been a lot of furor about the words, and I think the words of what Jim says, if taken literally, we should be worried if taken literally. But you point out, I think, that it's not necessarily true that we should take it all literally, because there's a lot of fluff and waffle in the middle there that could be interpreted multiple ways. And to a large degree, what we have to do is go back to it and say, what does that mean exactly? Exactly what policy are you suggesting here? And I suspect what's happening is that there's two things. It's worth responding to both. I suspect the policy recommendations coming out of this, I suspect will end up being tinkering. I don't think it'll be good tinkering, but this is probably a lot of grandiose statements. I'm not sure if they're going to follow through on grandiose actions. I got to say, as I say that, if I'm right, that would be a good thing. Because if they followed through on all the grandiose statements, I think it would be a supreme mistake for the future evolution of our economy and country. So I am hopeful that this is a lot of bluff and bluster. But also, if history is anything to go by, politicians are often full of bluff and bluster and grandiose statements. And then once they actually sit down and work out what does this mean, it could be a tweak here and a tweak there. I do worry about them targeting the super funds. I do worry about when they say greater sort of interaction and cooperation between the government and the corporate sector. That could, that could be that could be done in several different ways. Some of them supremely damaging, and some of them rather mild, and some of them perhaps useful. We really need to know the details first. But I worry that what he's talking about is not the mild version. I hope that what he does is the mild version. But what he's talking about here has echoes of a lot of things that have been growing over the last couple of decades. Some people have actually said it in the chat. Let's see if I can find some here. I think Percy said this twice. It's the ESG goals. A lot of the language here is also the language of ESG, the environment, the social and governance systems. And it's steadily being embedded through several different means, fair and foul, into the goals of a lot of companies. Sometimes basically being shoehorned in there by governments, sometimes by industry super funds, which, as was also pointed out by Percy, I think, that they are closely related to the unions. So you are getting lots of deviations from normal capitalism through ESG. Another term that's been thrown around a lot by people that it looks like Jim Chalmers is influenced by is stakeholder capitalism. And stakeholder capitalism, it sounds so benign, but if you scratch the surface, it's a very worrying idea. The whole point of capitalism is that corporations are supposed to represent the owners and benefit the owners, right? It's capitalism. You make a profit and the profit goes to the people who made the investment. That's the idea. Stakeholder capitalism basically means, that ownership thing we told you about? Yeah, not so much, right? I mean, you don't have to be an owner to have a stake. You could be a consumer or a worker or a neighbor or just anyone with a pet dog that ran across someone's front yard. And that basically means society. If society is the owner, remember that's not a real thing, right? That's always a code word for government. If society is the owner of the business, i.e. government is the owner of the business, that system of economics does not have a good track record at working. There's a couple of things here. The Chalmers thing has been likened to out and out socialism. I don't think that's quite right, because what he's talking about is this incestuous relationship with big business and big government and big unions. And out socialism just puts the leaders of big business up against the wall, shoots them, and takes their property. So this is not quite traditional socialism. It's been likened a bit to Whitlam, and you already mentioned that before, but it's not quite that either, because what Whitlam wanted to do was have the government take over all of the realms of how you help people, a massive welfare state, massive redistributions. He's not really talking about changing the welfare state. He's talking about changing the way business operates. So it's not quite socialist. It's not quite Whitlam-esque, what I call neo-socialism. It's instead this incestuous mix of big government, big corporations, big unions. And we need another word for that. There was a word for that. This is not a new idea. This is the thing I'm seeing showing up by some of the op-ed writers. Look at this wonderful new idea. It's not Whitlam. It's not Marx. It's a new idea. It's actually not a new idea. These ideas have been around for quite a while. They were quite prominent about 100 years ago. They were quite, I believe Jim Chalmers is a follower of an Italian Economist at the moment, these ideas were very popular amongst a certain Italian politician from about 90 years ago. If anyone knows their Italian history, Odysee, the Mussolini ideas were basically exactly this. But we don't need to get rid of business. What we do is we need to have a really close relationship between big government, big business, big unions. We all work together. And it may be better than or more efficient than socialism, but it's a bloody dangerous system. And of course, if you actually call it fascism, everyone gets upset because they say, no, Jim Chalmers doesn't hate the Jews. Look, fascism isn't only, the economic system of fascism isn't just about being a Nazi. The economic system of fascism was quite literally the idea that big business can exist, but they just have to cooperate in bed with big government. That was literally the idea of the fascist model of the economy. And it's not a new idea. I don't think it has a good track record at actually working as an economic idea. And I'm not trying to say Jim Chalmers is a fascist. I'm just simply saying that we can look at how this has worked in the past. And I don't think it's been pretty. The other thing to note about this is they talk a big game about how much they want to cooperate with big business and integrate with them. It's as if they're unable to draw a distinction between the market and a business. I mean, most people on my side of politics, we believe that a market is a better way of coordinating things than bureaucrats and politicians. That's true. That's not from a love affair with business. Indeed, business are often also the enemy of markets. Like I am not pro-business, I am pro-markets, and markets happen to have business in them. And it seems when a lefty stumbles across this idea and sees markets working, they think markets work because there's a couple of nice businesses. And so they co-opt those businesses. But it's not the existence of those businesses that make the market work. It's the nature, the dynamic nature and the competitive nature of the market that helps the market system to work. And sometimes a good market needs businesses to fail. If businesses make enough bad decisions, they fail. This idea that defending markets are about defending businesses, some people on our side of politics need to get out of that way of thinking. Bad businesses should fail. We're not here to defend businesses. I'm happy to defend people who make good decisions and get ahead and are rewarded for that, whether they are in any field of endeavor. But it's not just about defending businesses. And this approach that Chalmers has seems to be pro-business, anti-market, whereas I am pro-market and indifferent to any individual business. So that's some of the things. I do notice in some of his language, he talks about redesigning markets and that markets need to be carefully constructed. And I think once again, that shows a fundamental misunderstanding of what we mean with markets. Markets are an evolutionary concept. They're not designed. They're not constructed at all. They happen sort of spontaneously out of the interaction of a bunch of voluntary interactions between consenting adults. It is an evolved system. And one of the most dangerous things we have is these politicians that lack the humility to realize that they can't design such a complex system, meddling in a hugely complicated, evolved system that is probably beyond their capacity. It's beyond their ken to actually understand the dynamics. It's beyond the understanding of most people. Leonard Read famously wrote a book saying no one knows how to, it's called iPencil, and he pointed out that no one knows how to make a pencil. Seems like a crazy statement, but if you unwrap each part of making a pencil, someone has to know how to cut down the wood, which means they have to know how to use a chainsaw, which means they have to know how to make the chainsaw, which means they have to know how to get the metal for the chainsaw, which means they have to know how to make the iron, the steel, which comes from the iron, which comes from the mining. So you go back through all the parts of making a pencil. No one person can do it, but it comes together spontaneously, seemingly spontaneously, without any central controller. That's the important point. There's no central controller in that. And yet you can go and buy a pencil now for 10 cents. It involves the cooperation of literally thousands of people around the world who speak different languages and may not even like each other. They may hate each other. And yet thousands of people around the world all coordinated and managed to bring you a pencil at your local store for 10 cents. That is insane. And there is no controller. It wasn't designed. It wasn't carefully constructed, as Jim Chalmers seems to think. It was a spontaneous order coming together. And that is the dangerous thing I think there is when these politicians decide that they need to redesign markets in their own image. And often they have wonderful goals, right? I mean, their vision of the world, their vision of the future is not some dystopian nightmare. That's just the accidental byproduct of their arrogance and their lack of humility. So anyway, that's my rant on this. Now, I haven't spent as long thinking about it as you, so maybe I'll have to duck into it a bit more over the next week and see if I have any more.
Well, I want to have a closer look at just what these vehicles are and how they intend to direct investment. I mean, he talks about, well, we're not going to pick winners. Okay, that's great. Oh, but we're just going to set the priorities. So it's like this state-directed model that the French had, I think, in the 50s or 60s. Like, it doesn't. I wouldn't call it fascism. I'd call it corporatism or whatever the French used to call their system back in the day. But yeah, the government's got an idea of where the investment needs to go broadly. It's sort of national economic planning. That's the type of mindset. And one thing I'm waiting to see is, will they try and revive this idea of an infrastructure bank? So this was something that was raised during the time of the Rudd government, but got knocked down. Turnbull criticised Kevin Rudd as being Kevlani with reference to Kemlani, and there was the people were talking about, well, is this going to be the new transcontinental? I don't know if you remember, was it transcontinental, tricontinental, the merchant banking arm of the State Bank of Victoria that went bust in the late 80s, Victoria, when it just got into, just made all these crazy loans during that colossal boom in the late 80s. So there's a real risk to government balance sheets here, and I just want to wait and see just what they're proposing and whether there is some bold scheme like that the Treasurer could be announcing. That's what I'm going to be looking out for.
Yeah, I think on the retail politics, that's the right thing to look for. I should reiterate, look, I don't actually think Jim Chalmers is intending to be a fascist, because I don't think he intends to follow through on the logical consequences of his own article. But I still think it's worthwhile pushing back on the substance of the article, even if I don't think he'll follow through on it. I don't want people to think of it as an ideal, because I still think the ideals in there are very dangerous. And look, I also take your point. So in reality, he'll be, whether it's fascism or corporatism, it'll be a watered down version of that. And we need to see the details. I agree. But still, the Steelman version of that is worth addressing in case it seduces the thoughts of any young people that stumble across his ideas. And on you make the good point that perhaps corporatism is the better word for it than fascism. I've thought about that a bit lately. That could work. I wonder, though, whether there is a difference between the two. They both involve this incestuous relationship of big business and big government. Perhaps the difference is who has the upper hand. And I think in corporatism, perhaps the idea is that big business has the upper hand and they kind of use big government as their tool for success. And in fascism, it's big government has the upper hand and they use big business as their tool for enforcement or getting things done. But anyway, that's a thought bubble there on what the potential difference could be. I don't know which one Jim Chalmers hopes he would achieve. Probably not corporatism, but I'll cheekily put that aside for the moment.
Well, what he wants to achieve is he wants to get enough votes from the Labor left by imagining he can remake capitalism, where really he's going to create some investment vehicles. There'll be some additional money into renewables and housing, but is it really going to make much of a difference? And I don't know. I mean, in housing, that's one of their big challenges. I mean, the housing affordability is a massive problem now, and the number of people who can't find accommodation, particularly in Brisbane. I mean, I go for a walk along Wickham Terrace in Spring Hill, and I mean the normal, usual homeless people you see, but now you see there are people living in cars. They've got all their worldly possessions in the back of their vehicles. I mean, it's just tragic, and it's because for years we've just stopped people from building houses where people want them. So we've got problems that have been created in part through government regulation, and now they're going to be that's going to be used as one of the excuses for remaking capitalism and providing, I don't know, whatever they're going to do, subsidised housing. There'll be some money for that, for social housing, but it's not really going to be enough to solve the problem, in my view.
That is so often the theme, isn't it? A government program goes wrong, and the lefties turn around, point at capitalists and say, why did you do that? And then they use that to justify another government program that also goes wrong, and the whole cycle repeats itself. I do like the fact that every time I try to get us distracted in a conversation about the grandiose philosophy of the implications of Jim Chalmers' article, you bring us back to the real retail politics, which I think is entirely correct. I think your read on this is true, that his grand philosophical statements are mostly just fluff and waffle so that he can try to get the Labor leadership, and it'll mean a bit of tinkering. I think you're right. I just still enjoy rebutting the actual words as well. Anyway, this has been a fun discussion. There's been some good chat coming in. I haven't been able to keep up with it all. I apologize, but we might try to keep up with some of it at the end. I think in our last 10 minutes, I might try to touch on the topic that I was going to raise today. I think we're getting into a habit where the last topic always gets short-shrift, but perhaps that's just inevitable. Look, see if I can work this one out. The issue that's been vexing my mind lately is and I wouldn't be the only one that's talking about this lately, the issue of the voice and the voice referendum. I'm sure a lot of you have seen this discussion and the banter back and forth. And some of the discussion is about the nature of, is it a good idea to have such a direct focus on a specific race, race-based approaches, race-based issues, race-based houses, chambers, and the rest of it. I want to put that aside for the moment because I do, and ask a different question. Let's say, for sake of example, for sake of argument, let's say you did want to do things, did want to take race-specific action. You are happy with that idea of identitarianism and doing everything according to what race people have. The question I want to ask is the institutional question. I am an institutional economist by nature. The institutional question of what level of society or what institutional bodies in society are best to be addressing these issues. If you think it's going to make a benefit or it could make a benefit, which institutional structure would be best for helping it to succeed? And I'd suggest there's three ones that immediately come to mind. If you want to set up like an Indigenous advisory board, do you set it up at the community level where people are voluntarily getting together? Do you set it up at the government level done legislatively? You pass legislation a bit like ATSIC. We used to have ATSIC. That can be a legislative solution. Or do you set it up constitutionally? And my argument here is, put aside whether you think it's a good idea or not. I believe it is the best way to do it would be community-based. The next best way to do it would be legislative. And the worst one would be constitutional. And it's interesting that we've sparked this discussion immediately going to the constitutional solution. Labor has the numbers in Parliament right now, in the House and the Senate. They could pass the legislation for a new ATSIC. The body they say they want, they can create now. They have the power to create it right now. There's no reason they couldn't do it other than they've just chosen not to do it that way. Now, I would go a step further and say, wouldn't it be even better if instead of doing it themselves, they could have perhaps encouraged or incentivized a community-based group to come together? Like, I understand this idealistic libertarianism, hoping that we can just rely on people coming together. Like, maybe the Labor government isn't going to take that one. But of the options remaining, legislative versus constitutional, what is the upside to constitutional? Because I would suggest there's two very obvious downsides. One downside is that once something's in the Constitution, lawyers have a track record of discovering magic hidden words in between every magic hidden sentence in the Constitution. And they're able to interpret it to find new hidden powers and rights, and lack of rights and restrictions. So tweaking the Constitution is a very dangerous thing at the best of times. You really need to know exactly what you want to achieve out of it, and you need to be very careful. And the idea of introducing something that could be mistaken for a third chamber of Parliament, I know they say it isn't, but if it's close enough, then you're just relying on the ruling of all future judges and the arguments of lawyers that they will never interpret this in such a way as it might bite us. And that is a cost that we don't need to worry about if we go down the legislative path. So that's just a cost that has no reason for having it. The second one is, I understand a lot of people think that a body like this should exist. You might be right. But if you're right, let's legislate it and see. But a really important lesson for everyone, and I know people would say maybe I need to learn it more, is to always be aware that you could be wrong. I could be wrong, you could be wrong about a lot of things you think. I like to tell this little story. Like, Gene, I'll use you as the guinea pig here. How old are you, if I may ask?
I'm 47.
47. Do you agree with everything that you believed when you were 27? If
47
no. You met 27 you.
No, not at all.
And 27-year-old you, if you'd met 17-year-old you, would they agree on everything?
No.
The point is, everyone is wrong about something you don't even agree with yourself. Right? And so we always recognize, every year we get older, we recognize that old us was wrong about something. Well, let's glimpse 10 years in the future. Gene, do you think 57-year-old you will think 47-year-old you is right about everything? Unlikely.
No, almost certainly not.
It's a useful thought experiment to hopefully give people a little bit of a glimpse of humility. We might be wrong. Now, for the people that do want a voice, if you are wrong and we do it through legislation, it could be unwound. If you're right, then we'll learn that. We'll see it. The proof will be in the pudding. And if you're wrong, it can be unwound. But if we do it constitutionally, and you're right, no problem. What if you're wrong? It is really bloody hard to unwind it there. And then it's a potential plaything of lawyers and judges going into the future. So my argument, my strongest argument against the voice is not about whether it should exist or should not exist. It's this institutional question. And institutions are a really important part of economics, often undervalued in first and second year when you're going through. But I would argue that most things in life we're interested in the outcomes. The outcomes are caused by the actions. And the great insight that economists have over all of those other fake social sciences is we understand that your actions are determined by incentives. So you want the outcome, they're caused by actions. Everyone knows that. Economists understand it's nearly always caused by incentives. What are incentives caused by? Institutions. It's the fundamental building block of the way humans interact. And so I think it can be quite useful for us sometimes to stop and pause and ask those institutional questions. What level of society, what level of human interaction is best to coordinate this particular idea? And I think community first, if not that, legislative, but please not constitutional. So that's my argument. That's my institutional economics argument against the voice. What do you reckon, Gene?
Look, I want to see what the exact amendment to the Constitution is. So we're having a referendum to make a change to the Constitution. And if it's about recognising that Indigenous people lived in Australia before European settlement, then I don't have any problem with that. If it's something along the lines of, well, the Parliament has to take into account the views of Indigenous people, then okay, well, let's see the wording. I mean, that might be okay. I'd be careful about having some sort of body that could potentially override or call into question the decisions of the existing Parliament. I think that could be a bad idea. I am concerned about it, but I'd like to see what the model is that they propose. What's the exact amendment to the Constitution? I mean, I think, look, we ought to recognise that Indigenous people lived in this country before European settlement, and because those of us of European ancestry have, to a large extent, I mean, most of us have benefited greatly from living in Australia and growing up in Australia. And I think it's right to acknowledge that the Indigenous people lived here prior to European settlement.
As I warned everyone beforehand, Gene is a ratbag commie bastard, but that's okay. That's why we get to disagree sometimes. Look, I'm taking the piss a little bit there. Look, I think the debate's gone far enough now that we know what they're after. It is either a constitutionally mandated chamber. Now, they're saying it's a chamber without power, but that goes to my point before about that. Okay, that's a good argument as long as you trust every judge and lawyer. And of course, if you shouldn't trust any lawyers, but let alone all of them. But yeah, the idea of including something in the preamble or including a reference to everyone's debt to everyone else. That's actually what you said there sounds very similar to what Tony Abbott's been pushing for a while, to tweak the preamble to recognize, I think he says, recognize the Aboriginal heritage, the British Foundation, and the immigrant character of the country. I think that's his poetry, which is not bad poetry. But yes, I think the amendment might be something going a bit further than that. But look, maybe we can come back to this a bit later after the voice debate has raged for a while. We might even bring on a few people and pepper them with questions and see where we go with that. Look, feel free to bring up anything else while I'm slowly pausing to give you the moment. But there is a chance we may finally, after several weeks of failing, meet the goal of finishing inside the hour. So I'm going to go looking through for comments here. I think there's a few that might be worth addressing.
Yeah, there was a good comment about housing and what happens if you picked that one too. I thought that was a good one. Yeah, that was
I think well, my first take on this is, look, I'm not a big fan of the government really owning anything, full stop. But the bigger problem here is just if housing's your concern, and I think Jean spoke eloquently earlier about housing being a very real issue, not just something to debate to try to get votes, but it's becoming a very real issue for a lot of people. If you seriously want to address it, the conversation has to be about supply. And the Labor's policy here is about demand. It's about helping people to buy the pre-existing stock, which is not a long-term solution, right? So I don't think it's a good way to be changing the demand either. Look, changing the demand, it can help a little bit at the edges, because if demand goes up enough, it can put the prices up and incentivize people to build new houses. But it's only really solving it by driving the prices ever higher. So it's a bit of a messy solution. And the fundamental solution is increasing supply, and this isn't increasing supply. So that's my main complaint about this particular Labor policy on housing. What do you reckon, Gene?
Yes, yeah, but I think supply is the main issue. I think we get into trouble if we think we can solve the problem with schemes like this shared equity scheme. I mean, what's it doing? This is the government's policy they took to the election. So it's giving 10,000 eligible home buyers a chance to purchase their own property. And so the government's going to put up part of the money, and then I think you eventually buy out the government share, if I remember correctly. But look, it's relative to the total number of people who are struggling with getting affordable housing. That's really a drop in the bucket, isn't it? And how much can they really do? This is why we should rely on the market to build housing, because it's if the regulations aren't getting in the way, then the incentives are there for the private sector to build the housing that's necessary, and you don't have to try and come up with all these elaborate schemes from the government to improve housing affordability that aren't really addressing the fundamental problem.
So now it's my turn to be the commie rat bastard. Well, not quite. But look, I often agree with a solution that sounds like let the market do it. I got to say that the problem at the moment is the pre-existing restrictions on the ability to supply more. If we just sit back and say, we don't need to change anything, the market will fix it. Well, the market can't spontaneously overcome bad legislation. I mean, to some degree it can. That's called the black market. But I don't think the black market is a good solution to increasing housing supply stocks. I don't think that's going to work. So the market can help to solve these problems if it is given space to work. The restrictive zoning laws around too many parts of our country, not everywhere, by the way. There are some places that do allow building growth. It's just often those aren't the places where people want to live. And you made that point very well earlier, where you said they're not allowing construction to happen where people want it. And that's a crucial part of that sentence. The planning laws are a difficult one. Often people want to go to the federal government. Federal government doesn't control the planning laws, although they could potentially incentivize an improvement in planning laws. Because the current problem is, if there is development in an area, which level of government receives the benefit? Which level of government gets more revenue from that development? Primarily, the federal government. They get the benefit from development. Which level of government is in control of the planning and zoning? State and local. So you've got a mismatch of incentives, right? State and local government get the upside of regulation, i.e. getting more votes from the NIMBYs, but they don't get the downside of reduced production. And the federal government's in a reverse situation. So there needs to be perhaps some institutional alignment of incentives between the layers of government there. But it can be a messy question. Were there any other questions here that jumped out at you? I think I saw one that just a comment maybe that I wanted to throw up here from Grant. This is back on I think the Jim Chalmers story. Central planning went out with the Soviet Union. Super funds should concentrate on growing our money, not engaging in the financially backing dumb government interventions. I very much agree. I got to say, I don't know if you'd agree with this, Gene, but I believe the only way to fix super funds, if we're just relying on kumbaya and hoping that the super funds are going to be responsible and that governments won't meddle, then I think we've already lost. I think the only way to ensure super funds start getting their incentives better aligned is to make super voluntary. I know there's a lot of other things people say that they think they can do to make super funds behave better. I think the only thing that'll make super funds start focusing laser-like on keeping their customers happy, i.e. the people who save with them, that's their customers. How are they going to focus on keeping us happy? With the very real threat that we're about to leave. And I think that threat of leaving, that threat of exit is the fundamental difference between like the market and the government. The market, you don't like something, you don't vote for the other supplier, you leave, you walk into the other shop. You use exit. That is the way you get your point across. Whereas the government, you can't exit, you're stuck here. All you've got is voice. Once every 3 years, you have a 1 in 16 million say between two options that are very similar, which the voice is a far less powerful feedback mechanism than exit. And so I want to give savers that exit power back by making super voluntary. But I know that spooks half the people on my side of politics as well.
Yeah, let's talk about that another week. I've got a few thoughts, but I'll save them. The question I thought was there was a good question about, is there a chance Australia could be self-sustaining through nuclear electricity? Look, I suppose politically there's no chance it will occur, unfortunately, even if the economics stack up. And it's really Bill Gates has got a great line in his book about how it's the one carbon-free source of sustainable power or reliable power that is proven, and we can do it huge scale. So that's the one sentence case for nuclear energy, as he calls it. And if it may well be a good option for us, given that what we're doing now is we're massively ramping up the amount of wind power and solar power, and we're hoping that we can build enough stored this pumped hydros, which is going to cause, I don't know, there'll be all sorts of environmental challenges to this, but that's the hope. We're going to have all this pumped hydro, new dams or expanded dams, and we're going to have all of these, everyone's going to get a Tesla Powerwall. We're going to have the grid scale storage. There's going to be this huge investment in storage. Look, if that proves to be uneconomic or we just can't do it in time, then we may have to think about something like nuclear. I wouldn't object to it, but politically, I think it's just not going to happen.
A slightly different take on the answer here. Firstly, politically, I think it's getting to the point where it's, I think, getting closer to inevitable. I think we are going to eventually embrace nuclear. I think it's about the point where we were, say, 5 or 10 years before gay marriage was legalized. And about 2 minutes after that, everyone said, I was always for it. It was inevitable. But about 5 years before it happened, Barack Obama was running around saying, no, we must never do it. So these things, when they switch quickly. And I think we're getting closer to the point. However, even if we do switch to embrace nuclear power or legalize it, firstly, the first point is legalizing nuclear power. That doesn't necessarily mean we switch, because it has to then be economic, right? So I think absolutely it should be legalized tomorrow. It's ridiculous that it isn't. But is it economic? Well, that depends on a bunch of other factors. Presently, coal and gas are probably more economic than nuclear. But these things can change, right? Technology is changing all the time. It could, if we did end up becoming primarily a nuclear energy powered economy, being self-sustainable there doesn't necessarily help us if we're still uranium exporters, because the international change in uranium prices will still change our uranium prices. As I was saying before, the same way that the Ukraine war impacted on our coal and gas inputs into our electricity system now, the price of nuclear power will also still be determined by the price of uranium to some degree, and the price of uranium will still be determined on the international markets, even if we are, and we are if we want to be, self-sustaining. We have far more uranium than we would ever need. So we would, that's why we export so much currently. If we started using it, we would still be exporting some. So we would still be susceptible to the ups and downs of international markets for the uranium price. I did say before we might finish under an hour. Guess what, Gene? We're not finishing under an hour. Last comment then to Melissa. It sounds like the Voice is a government-funded lobby group the government of the day can listen to or not. Well, maybe. As Albo has said, it would be a brave government not to listen. But I guess we will see. That debate is going to kick off in earnest over the coming months, because it really is the start. Both the no debate and the yes debate has come out and said they're really about to get rolling. So expect to see a lot more of that discussion over the coming months. With that said, thank you everyone for tuning in. We do these live streams, Gene and I, and perhaps guests in the future if we feel like inviting them on. We do this every Tuesday, 7 p.m. Queensland time, which is 8 p.m. New South Wales and Victoria time. It's streamed on Facebook, on YouTube, Australian Taxpayers Alliance, The Good Source, and my personal pages for John Humphreys on Facebook and YouTube. Please go and have a look for those. Give us a follow on those platforms. Go and find me on Rumble as well. I put these up on Rumble. Go find me and follow me on that platform as well. And we look forward to seeing you back here next week. Let's see if I can find my outro video. All right, thanks a lot, Gene. I'll see you next time.
Definitely, John.
DJ, what do you think of the budget?
Budget naughty.
Yeah, budget naughty.